Hi everybody, thank you so much for being here. If you're new to my channel, my name is Ben and I'm a wildlife and landscape oil painter. I'm also a secondary art teacher, and on this channel I've made videos showing behind the scenes of both my own work and several demos that I've done for my students at school. Today I've actually got two demos to show you, and they're both based on an art style that is about as far away from my own as it's possible to be. Now, when I started teaching at my school, there really wasn't any existing curriculum available for me to use, so I had to start from scratch. And as I set about crafting new lessons, I decided that I would do a series of projects based on optical illusions. I would show the students examples of various artistic illusions used throughout history, from Renaissance chapels to contemporary street art. We also looked at the mind-bending work of M.C. Escher and similar impossible designs. However, we eventually landed on a very different kind of illusion, one that employed stark contrast, abstract patterns, and occasionally precise mathematics. This was the op art movement of the 1950s and 60s. Op art, or optical art, is designed to fool the eye into perceiving depth, movements like vibration or swirling, and even colors, all while primarily using only black and white. Now, for my first demo, I wanted to come up with some project that would rely heavily on op art's high contrast patterns, but would still give my students a chance to use illustration and color. This proved to be challenging, but I finally found the solution in the work of several modern artists on social media. These artists had maintained the spirit of op art, but demonstrated an even greater effect of perspective and depth. They employed a human figure interacting with what becomes a three-dimensional plane. With my project and goals defined, I set about crafting my demo piece. Now, in spite of the somewhat simple appearance this art style can have, I knew that many of the examples I had found were created digitally. To create repeated lines and shapes by hand with the same precision would be challenging. Once I had figured out the basic composition, I carefully measured and penciled in the design. I opted to use one-point perspective, and even though it is usually a bad compositional choice, I knew that in this style I could get away with placing both my horizon line and vanishing point in the very center of the image. In addition to including a human figure, I would be asking my students to incorporate a spot color somewhere in their designs. I like the yellow and gold seen in some of my references, so I used it for mine as well. Lastly, I needed to draw my person and their shadow to complete the 3D effect. I decided that instead of a solid silhouette, my figure would have a few highlights in the same color family as my spot color. And with that, I finished my first op art inspired demo. Now, in spite of the fairly simple appearance of this art style, this project was deceptively difficult, and it required a good deal of patience too. But I was happy with my final and grateful to get a chance to try out a brand new art style. However, I still had one more class in need of a new project. Thinking about the simple repetition of lines seen in the more basic op art designs, I was reminded of another project that many young students get to try in art class. A simple shape, often a hand, would be traced, and then parallel lines would be drawn over the page. When the lines crossed the shape, they would be bent to give a three-dimensional effect. I was curious to see if any artists had ever taken this method any further for their own work. It took a good deal of searching, but I eventually found a few who had. Now, in spite of the somewhat creepy appearance, I was fascinated how this method although it avoided traditional shading, actually created a natural 3D shaded effect resulting from the lines bunching together. It reminded me of topographical maps and the similar effect that they can produce. Before finalizing the project, I found a few more references that added one more wrinkle to this unique style. Not only did they bend lines, but they also adjusted their thickness to create areas of light and shadow. Once again, after naming this project, I laid out the project goals. I knew these two requirements would be tricky and would either make or break the design. I try to make my demos more complex than what I will expect from my students. And in the end, I chose this memorable and fairly intense photo of a World War II GI as my reference. The light background is represented by the thin, evenly spaced lines. The challenge began when I needed to warp the lines around the shape of the soldier. I often tell my students that they need to think in 3 dimensions when they draw, and that is especially true in this project. Now, I had decided to complete the soldier using unbroken lines. No matter how much a line bent or changed thickness, I made sure it remained intact and connected to the corresponding line on the other side. However, when I reached the ground, I decided to drop the lines so I could have more diagonal movement. I also broke the lines in some sections, hoping to better show the layers of the foreground. Now, despite being crafted for a younger class, this demo actually ended up being just as challenging as the first one. And even though they both were inspired heavily by the op art movement, they actually presented distinct challenges that were totally their own. Now, some people have asked me if I get frustrated having to postpone my own work so that I can teach. And honestly, I can feel that way sometimes. But on the other hand, these lessons have provided me an incentive to study artists and try out techniques that I know I never would have on my own. So I am grateful for my own continued education through this process, and I only hope I can emerge a better artist because of it.